Hello there, Homeschool Nolan here to help you navigate learning in the digital age. It's Asian Pacific Heritage Month, and today I'd like to continue my series on ethnic studies by talking about Bruce Lee and what he can teach our kids today. Bruce Lee, of course, was a martial arts legend and movie star. 48 years after his death, he continues and remains a legend around the world. Now, Bruce Lee is probably not someone your kids will learn about in school. But after learning more about him, I proudly decided this month to include him in my own homeschool ethnic studies curriculum using this book, Who Was Bruce Lee, from the popular Who HQ series. Now, teaching about Bruce Lee to kids is actually pretty fun. As part of my class on Bruce Lee, I showed the homeschooling students in my class video clips of Bruce Lee. Now, these weren't clips of him fighting. They were clips of him working out, doing fingertip push-ups, giving interviews, and sharing his teachings and philosophies on life. There's a reason why millions of fans around the world still admire him today. His teachings, combined with the way he lived his life, can still teach us important lessons which are still relevant today, especially to young people. First, Bruce Lee was a self-learner. We can't say he was a homeschooler because he actually did go to private school. But he didn't do well in school. In fact, he got low grades and often got into trouble by getting into fights. But just because he wasn't a good student doesn't mean he wasn't a good self-learner. Bruce was actually a very motivated self-learner. He obviously learned Kung Fu and martial arts very well, but he also loved books and he read a lot. He's said to have owned over 2,500 books. In college, Bruce studied philosophy and became a philosopher. Bruce never stopped learning. Even though he was already a great martial artist, he would always try to learn from each fight and figure out how he could get even better. Being a great self-learner is what enabled him to become a great teacher, both as a martial artist and as a philosopher. The lesson for kids today is that regardless of how well you do in school, the important thing is you must never stop learning things on your own. No matter how good you think you are, you must always be hungry and eager to learn more so that you can get even better. Bruce Lee, through his life, also showed us how to handle adversity. We sometimes hear today how kids are fragile or like snowflakes, meaning they don't handle rejection or adversity very well. Bruce Lee, if anything, was not fragile, and he was not a snowflake in the face of adversity. For example, his dream was to become a huge movie star in America. But as an Asian American, it was very difficult for him, for obvious reasons, to get decent roles in Hollywood. As a Chinese person, he was often only offered roles as a white man's sidekick or as an unflattering, stereotypical Chinese male. Perhaps the ultimate insult was when he tried to get the leading role in the TV series Kung Fu, but was passed over in favor of a white actor playing a Chinese American character instead. But rather than complain or feeling sorry for himself, Bruce never gave up on his ambition, and he worked to find another path. After not finding stardom in Hollywood, Bruce in 1970 returned to Hong Kong and made a few successful movies like The Big Boss and Fists of Fury. These Hong Kong movies were good enough that they finally got the attention of Hollywood producers. And in 1972, Warner Brothers finally offered Bruce Lee the leading role in a major Hollywood production called Enter the Dragon. The lesson here is that racial prejudice is unfair. People are unfair. Life is unfair. They can close doors on us. But Bruce showed us what to do when we run into such adversity. Instead of giving up, sometimes we must simply find another path to get to our destination. Bruce Lee also showed us how to be a fighter. Being a fighter isn't just about throwing kicks or punches. It also means never accepting defeat easily. In 1970, Bruce seriously injured his back while lifting some weights. The injury was so serious that he laid on his back for months, and doctors told him that he would never be able to do martial arts again. But Bruce refused to accept defeat. He worked through the pain and gradually worked his way back to recovery. It's hard to believe that the man we see fighting in movies like Game of Death and Enter the Dragon was actually told he would never fight again before those movies were made. Bruce Lee was also inclusive. Inclusive is a term we hear a lot today. But back in the 1960s, Bruce Lee was ahead of his time in terms of being inclusive. He taught martial arts to both men and women from all different races, white, black, yellow, brown. However, many of the older traditional Kung Fu masters of the time didn't like that and felt that Kung Fu should never be taught to non-Chinese students. But Bruce was an American who was born in San Francisco. He grew up in Hong Kong, and his mother was half European. Perhaps his unique background is what gave him a unique outlook on people, and Bruce literally fought them over this so he could teach Chinese martial arts to students of all colors. If you had to summarize the teachings of Bruce Lee, you could probably do so in his most famous quote, "Be water, my friend." What did he mean by that? Well, water is strong. It can crash. It can sweep you away with its powerful currents. So we should be strong like water. Water flows around rocks, and so should we around obstacles in life. Water is shapeless and can't be punched or hurt, and so should we try to be like water. If you're interested in learning more about the life of Bruce Lee, I recommend you check out Bruce Lee, A Life by Matthew Polly. It's linked in the notes below. It's surprisingly packed with a lot of detail and information for a man who lived for only 32 years. You will find that Bruce Lee was much more than a Kung Fu movie star. 48 years after his death, Bruce remains perhaps the most influential Asian American in popular culture. He bridged two cultures together and taught important life lessons that are especially valuable for kids today. That's why, as a homeschooling parent, I proudly made Bruce Lee an important part of my ethnic studies curriculum. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.